Welcome back to the workshop. Today I'm doing the winding on a new viola bow, which is just in the process of being finished. So this will be a silver winding with a leather thumb lapping. I've shown this process before, but I'll talk through it again as I do it. Just start off with winding, running a few winds of silver back over itself before leading up to the start point. I've marked out the start and finish points, holding a reasonable tension without being too much to break the wire. Run it back around to the start point, which is the bottom facet of the octagonal where the eyelet mortise is in. Start point across the thread back over the first round to start to hold it and block it in place, and keeping the winds nice and tight. And just run it back over itself 4 or 5 times initially just to pin it in place, and because silver wire doesn't compress like cotton or a textile thread does, which compresses as you know, if you're doing this process with cotton or thread or rope some sort, it compresses as you bind over the top of it, and that helps to hold it in place. Wire doesn't do that, so it's relying purely on the friction. And I suppose some element of pressure, but squashing it in there. So once I've gone over 3 or 4 times, I'll put a little tension and just pull that wire tail through and continue to run over the top until I've got roughly 1/2 centimetre. Holding that in place, and I find that's generally sufficient to hold the end of the wire in and prevent the first few winds from getting loosening off. Use my thumbnail on my right hand to keep these wire tight in on itself. Each wind. I have the wire tensioned through the leather jaws on my small vise, and rather than pulling the wire through that under tension, which risks breaking the wire because it's only 0.25 mil gauge, I just back the tension off and pull it through and pin it in place again. It's a little bit more tedious that way, but safer, and I can control the pressure with my hands. It's about 1/2 centimetre there over the top of that, and I'll just holding onto this tail because I want to use that for the other end. Trim that off. Continue winding. Continue this process till I get to the other end. that kind viewer suggest a video on what's called back winding, which is a method of winding to finish off the thread at the opposite end, where obviously you can't, it's much more difficult to wind the wire or thread back over itself. So you need to cut a sufficient amount of wire or thread to enable you to finish the job at a certain point, at a certain distance before you finish. And then you wind that thread basically in the opposite direction, leaving a loop, and that way you can then tuck the end underneath, and as you unwind the loop it winds back over the end of the thread, and then at the end of the process you just pull the thread through, and in theory that then holds it tight and tightens the thread, the freshly wounds over the end, and tightens it in place. It works well with textile threads, cotton or rope, because the thread, both because when you pull it through and pull it tight, it will tighten the rounds back on itself, and also because the thread compacts underneath and compresses underneath the pressure of the loops that are wound over the top of it. The example video was of an archery string being, the end of an archery string being back wound. It was an excellent video, very helpful and interesting, and I did experiment with it. However, I found that due to the differences in wire, properties of wire, and textile threads or ropes or cords, there's a few things about it that I found caused it to actually not work as well as the method that I use. One of those being, it's much more, I found it difficult to judge the distance needed for the amount of silver wire to finish off to get to the end. Also because you need to do so many more winds back over the end to get, say, a full 1/2 centimetre's length. It's a lot more than 3 or 4 or 4 or 5 winds. I'm not sure exactly how many there are there, but there's quite a fair length of silver thread. So that makes back winding, because of how long it is, it makes it very fiddly to do. And then when you pull the tail end of the winding through or thread through at the end, it doesn't, the wire doesn't actually tighten back up on itself, partly because it's going around an octagonal shape, not a round shape. So each time it's wound around, it forms a small kink on each octagonal facet, and that means it's much less likely to tighten up as you pull it through, apart from maybe the very final time around, and then also because it doesn't compress in on itself, it doesn't actually add any extra holding ability. I find the method that I use, I'm able to do it a way that holds the wire in place, and I can judge very accurately the finishing point. And I've actually never had them come loose, so or come undone, so I don't think I'm doing anything wrong in the process that I'm using. It was a fascinating insight and very useful, so thank you to the viewer that suggested it. Measuring how long I've got to go. I need to go. The end point on these will be 29mm from the end of the eyelet mortise. Will be the end of the frog, the nose point of the frog when the bow is fully wound down. End it just a millimetre before that to give the leather room to finish off. And I'll start the finishing process sort of 5 to 7mm before that. So finish the winding 3cm from the end of the eyelet mortise and start the finishing process about sort of 35 to 37mm from the end of the eyelet. Right about here. Take the end of the loose scrap piece of wire and tuck it underneath, and then continue binding over the top to leave our little channel. We're going to then tuck the end under. There's all sorts of things you can do to finish the ends of these off if you're using, say, rope or thread, or you can create a little loop and tuck the end through the loop and pull it back through and then pull it all tight. And all those sorts of processes don't work with wire. So it's different properties. Couple mil to go. It's about 3 winds per millimetre, and I've got 6 millimetres, almost 7 millimetres there, so it's about 21 winds, roughly 20 winds, say, over the top. So if I was to allow enough room for 20 loops in a back winding process, that's a lot of wire. And maybe I tuck it under farther than it needs to be, but so from here, trim off the end, and I'll take that end and flatten it with a hammer. And that gives me a nice flat thin portion at the end of the wire to be able to tuck underneath. I put a little upwards kink on the very end just with my thumbnail, and that gives a little hook that'll poke back up through. Pull out the scrap wire. I just run a little Vaseline over the wire so that it's lubricated and pulls through nice and easily. Taking the end of the wire with the little hook on it, and just gently run that underneath. Then take the pliers and loop them around a few times, and then pull that through in one nice smooth motion, and pulls it through nice and tight. Generally then I shall pull the wire back on itself, and that tucks it back under a tighter portion of the wind. Trim that off and that'll hold tight. That's both ends of the winding tucked in, and we're ready to fit our leather.